Welcome everyone to the final Tuesday Times Roundtable of the fall 2014 semester. Thank you for being here and good luck on the impending finals. What microphone is that from? That's probably me touching this too much. We have a very exciting final roundtable for you today. As you can see, we have a panel discussion. We have really great speakers who are here to contribute to the topic today. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our moderator, and then the moderator will introduce the panelists that have joined us today, and we'll have a great discussion. So today's moderator is Cynthia Valdez from the U.S. Fund for UNICEF, where she acts as Miami's Community Engagement Fellow. Cynthia is a graduate of the University of Florida with a degree in Women's Studies and Public Policy. Cynthia has been an active leader and social justice advocate in Miami for 6 years, working with minority groups and organizations to combat human trafficking, improve education, and advocate for the improvement of public health policies. She has lived and worked in Latin America, pursuing her passion for international work, and returned to her hometown of Miami to continue her advocacy efforts for women and children. So I introduce to you Cynthia Valdez from the U.S. Fund for UNICEF.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out. I really appreciate your time. I'm going to be introducing the panel. So Special Agent Victor Williams is a special agent at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and he is the coordinator of the Miami Human Trafficking Task Force and U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Brenda Metrick is actually the Assistant State Attorney for the Miami-Dade Office of the State Attorney, 11th Judicial Circuit. She has been an Assistant State Attorney for Miami-Dade County for 20 years and has specialized in homicide, capital sexual battery prosecutions, and the use of the Internet in the exploitation of children. Don Thompson is the Assistant Executive Director for Christie House, and Christie House provides a healing environment for all child victims of sexual abuse and their families. Layla Lombardo, Youth and Family Program Director and Artist Facilitator for ArtSpring, and it's a nonprofit organization in Florida that uses arts-based educational programming to develop self-growth, effective life skills for incarcerated women, men, and youth. So thank you for coming, ladies and gentlemen. The format of the panel will be going to what human trafficking is, discussing different categories of what trafficking is, and then also going into a 15-minute Q&A. Special Agent Victor Williams, would you like to begin?
Thank you. So you guys just came in this class or whatever you call this area, and I hope you were able to read some of the stories on the screen. Have you guys had a second to look at that? You feel that? These are all true stories. Does it get your attention? Yeah? I normally like looking at the last one, a 13-year-old being raped by a police officer. You know, interesting stuff, all true stories. So now that I have your attention, let's go and define what human trafficking is. So when you look at the definition of human trafficking, there are 3 words that really point out for us, and that's force, fraud, and coercion. When you're over the age of 21, whether it's labor trafficking, sexual exploitation, debt bondage, begging, these are the words, the elements of the crime, force, fraud, and coercion, unless you're under the age of 18. If you're under the age of 18 and say you are a commercially sexually exploited child, and we like saying those words, and Don probably tell you why later, instead of saying that this kid was pimped out, you don't need those elements. If you're a commercially sexually exploited child, instant trafficking. I don't have to prove the elements of force, fraud, and coercion. Real quick, I give you a quick definition to distinguish the two. A lot of people confuse human trafficking with human smuggling. Human smuggling, I smuggle you into the country and you're free to go. Human trafficking, I smuggle you into the country and I exploit you. And the final thing that I want to say to define human trafficking is I do not need to have transportation. I don't need to cross a state line. I don't need to cross a country boundary or border to have human trafficking. You could be born in Miami and you could be trafficked in Miami. So that's our basic trafficking definition.
Thank you so much. So my first question to begin, as far as a general question, is what kinds of cases are we seeing in South Florida in regards to sexual exploitation, domestic servitude, and what do the victims look like? Are they mostly adults? Are they mostly children? And all of you can respond.
Well, I think it's important to distinguish that what Vic does is federal, what I do is state. So what I can say, just step back for a second, and if I could, is that what we're experiencing here is a paradigm shift. So we've seen many in the past century, right? You're talking about women's suffrage, civil rights, domestic violence. All of these things were what we call paradigm shifts. We went a 180 from where we were to where we are now legally. We're having the same thing happening with how we see human trafficking. And what I mean by that is I mean domestic commercial sexual exploitation. And it's what's traditionally been perceived as pimps and prostitutes. And we are having just a tremendous understanding and breaking that apart and really trying to grapple with that, really, I think, systematically for the first time in the history of certainly state law enforcement. So what we focus on primarily are going to be girls that are born and raised in either Florida or other states, and they brought in. We have some foreign borns, but the majority of my cases are definitely United States citizens and born here, and they are probably half are minors. Majority of those are DCF children, that is children in the welfare system. Obviously no surprise there. And adults who, majority of which were in the welfare system.
Anyone else?
I just want to add, Christie House specializes in child victims of sexual abuse and their non-offending family members. And in 2007, and this is speaking to Brenda's paradigm shift, there started to be a discussion about commercial sexual exploitation. We didn't know anything about it. Now, you would think that an advocacy center that specializes in child victims of sexual abuse would know something about it. But in fact, it's a really hidden crime. The girls that we work with, and we work specifically with girls, the age of entry is between 12 and 13. We've worked with girls as young as 11. Most of the girls we work with currently are 15, 16 years old, although we can work up to 19. Most of them have experienced previous victimization of sexual abuse. So they were victimized as young children. They are often in child welfare, so they've experienced such trauma that they had to be removed from their home. And one of the overriding characteristics is that these girls tend to run away. And they run away, and we know that most kids who run away are back home within 24 hours. These girls are either out on the street over 48 hours, or they're chronically running away on the street. Due to the trauma that they've experienced, running away might have been an effective way to get out of the trauma at first, but it puts them in more danger. And so, in fact, then they're exposed to traffickers who are very good at spotting those girls that need some attention and some affection, that are really feeling isolated, and they exploit those girls. So those are specifically the girls we're working with. And as Brenda said, we're talking about citizen children, children born in the United States.
Okay. I want to add to that it is also, from my perspective as a cultural worker in the community, working really with deep and marginalized populations, both at the prevention and in the intervention and also in some reentry settings, that you see the compounding factors that put somebody at risk are really across the board. When I work in homeless shelters, or I work in prisons, detentions, or at-risk communities, you encounter the same communities in drug rehab facilities and so forth. And I think that the lines of victimizations are very blurred, and that is not just for law enforcement or therapists and people who work in the field, but also for the victims themselves, that you have been victimized, but you don't actually understand yourself to be a victim. And that predicates an additional risk factor that really paves a way for this being a cultural norm, to have a pimp kind of boyfriend, or to socialize in the vein of premature, very sexualized pop culture and interpersonal engagement. So, that I think where really a lot of the challenge lies, that we think of sex trafficking as something that, how do we recognize a victim, or, what do they look like, or who are they? They are us. They're everywhere. Right? And I think that's one of the hardest things to wrap our head and our hearts around.
I just attended the Broward Human Trafficking Coalition meeting, and Broward has their own issues like Dade have their own issues, and they actually had some interesting stats to talk about what Brenda was saying, how we look at these situations, and a lot of times these are at-risk kids. Well, they just did a study. Every time they do their meeting, they always have someone that look at how many victims they've come across since their last meeting. And so this is an interesting stat. They had 66 victims. And out of the 66, 54 of them were community kids. So let's define that. You have your at-risk kids that are already in the system, runaways or some kind of trouble. And you have your, what they define their community kids are kids that are not in trouble, that are coming from normal, households, families, mother's a doctor, or whatever. 54 out of the 66. So one of the things that they were seeing in Broward, and why it's so important that every time I do a presentation, especially to students or kids, I want to let you know, you guys are being targeted. You guys are being targeted. And I'm glad you're here, because you really need to learn how to define and understand when someone is approaching you. But that was an interesting number, just to add so we see these traffickers are knowing that the at-risk kids are being guarded. They know that we're looking at them. They know that we're focusing on them. So now they've changed the shift and started going after these community kids that are not in the system. And so that was an interesting change to learn today in those numbers.
Well, I think when you say that, what a pimp would not also use that term, but because it's easier and it's less wieldy than commercial sexual exploiter. But when a pimp is looking and targeting a child or anyone, what he's looking for is somebody who's vulnerable, who he can easier break that person's mind. And that's what this is about. You actually break a person's mind so they believe that they can't function without you.
I'm glad you brought that up. I really, really am. Because so human trafficking, as UNICEF has been reported in all 50 states. And Florida is actually number 3 in the nation right now. And so one of my questions was going to be, well, how do you identify a victim? And there's so many different types of victims. I mean, Special Agent Victor Williams said, college students are victims. Young kids in elementary schools are victims. Young women, boys are victims as well. So what are the commonalities among these victims, other than the fact that there's low self-esteem or they come from a broken household? And if they don't have those factors in their lives, then what other factors may lead to them becoming a victim of human trafficking?
Well, from my experience, it's just been, the person that's vulnerable. I gave you like definitions that we define by law. But if you, under my human smuggling definition, I always put in red, the most simple form of trafficking is someone being exploited. Maybe they have a vulnerability. Maybe they don't feel loved at home, whatever it may be. And that's why everybody's a target. A lot of times when I have an opportunity to educate parents about human trafficking, I just, like to let them know that a lot of victims that I come in contact with very rarely have this relationship with their family, which exposes them. So that's kind of like the first step when you lose that connection with family.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, I would also say that these victims often have more than one trauma. So they live in dangerous neighborhoods, and they go to schools where there's a lot of danger, and family situations aren't very stable. And there's probably some mental health issues either with parents or with the child themselves. So that you're facing all kinds of trauma. And that really, if it's unresolved, that is, you're not getting therapy, it really leaves you at risk for being preyed upon by these traffickers. They're very good at convincing very young girls that they're there to help them. They're going to approach somebody on the street, at a bus stop, at South Beach, the places where teens might hang out, and say, "Sweetie, you're by yourself. What's going on? Tell me I would never let anybody as pretty as you be sitting out here all by yourself." And so they run a really nice line on these girls, and the girls buy into it because from their previous experience, there's no way that they can differentiate between sex and love and what's true care, because their caretakers haven't been the people that they really needed them to be to depend on.
Well, I just want to chime in also, because we're going again to this, what do victims look like, or where do we find them, right? So if we were to take a sample of a general population, and notably, I work with 1 Billion Rising as well. It's a worldwide call to action to end violence against women and girls. And Eve Ensler, the founder, she does famously these sort of stand-up, raise your hand, impromptu polls when she gathers large groups of people to say who in this room has known anybody who's been the victim of sexual violence, who in this room has, been affected by sexual violence, and so forth. And before you know it, the entire room is standing by some association with these sorts of experiences. And I don't think we have to highlight the recent results in the news, be it in the sports leagues or in entertainment and college campuses and universities, the prevalence of sexual violence that is really everywhere, and as such paves the way of this being in our collective conscience and in our sort of collective societal everyday reality, and it keeps pushing the boundary of sort of acceptability and exposure further and further to a really unacceptable or critical edge that, again, I think predisposes any and all of us to these kind of situations. Because, for instance, a victim of sexual violence, oftentimes they don't actually know that they have been a victim of sexual violence, right? It's like, what are you talking about? This is my boyfriend, right? So where is that line crossed, and when do you become a sort of a clinical case? And most times the affected populations don't really even know that. And also, especially because the deferment of the reaction to trauma there can be a very large gap, right? Because a person is so compromised in a moment of assault or violation that, from a psychological perspective, it's often, more beneficial to disassociate with the experience and to pretend it didn't happen, right? And to sort of, not speak about it, or so a long time can go by. And then also to say, how does somebody become a victim? It could go quite quickly, because here's the thing: once you're in a position that compromises you from a psycho-emotional level, the ability to be in all of your good senses, so to speak, right, is much compromised, even by one encounter of being brutalized by somebody. All of a sudden, you don't know how to speak out for yourself, or so forth. And so now you were at risk before, but now you're more at risk, right? And with each incident, you become more at risk, to the point where you are literally trapped, not necessarily in all cases by chains and enclosures of physical sort, but by, like you were saying, a mental coercion.
Thank you.
And to follow up on that, but before I do, every time I do human trafficking presentations or whatever, we focus on the sexual exploitation, because it is more serious. But we have an issue with labor trafficking, which is a huge issue. How many of you guys work in restaurants that you probably know one of the people you're working with is undocumented? I'm not going to come after you, trust me, but I just want to. And if you are, imagine that person being told, listen, I know you're undocumented. If you don't give me half your money, or you're not doing certain things, I'm going to expose you to immigration. That is a form of trafficking. But going back to what we were talking about before, and I learned this from Brenda, we've done a couple presentations together, and she could really get into the details, because there's a lot of this stuff has to do with your past. And I don't know how technical we want to get at this, the whole frontal lobe stuff and your brain not developing where you can come up with coping skills, and you have these issues as a kid and they're never been addressed, and you're toting this thing around that's never been addressed, that kind of like, again, exposes you and make you vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, I won't go too far, but I come to these things to make you guys work, okay? Because you guys are the future, and we've got all kinds of things that are not solved, all right? So I'm not going to be one of these, these older adults who's going to be, let me tell you what the answers are, because clearly, okay, we don't have them, or we wouldn't be in this situation. So right now, one of the reasons why we are able to blow apart this entire subject is because of the past 10 years of neuroscience research, okay? The human brain is still the last frontier and remains the last frontier. And we are learning now things that are revolutionizing, quite frankly, the entire legal system, to the point where we really can't even begin to go there, because it will really shake foundations. So, but one of this is how the human brain develops. And the bottom line is what we are realizing, and this sounds silly and obvious, but it's something that is very much debated and still being extraordinarily researched. Trauma affects the developing brain, okay? Now you can change that. The brain is plastic, but the older you get, the harder it is to change. What we're talking about are children who, the average age of entry into prostitution is 13 in the United States. 1 in 3 women in the United States is a victim of sexual abuse of some form, okay? But all factors such as alcoholism, domestic violence, drug addiction in the home, extreme poverty and neglect, all of these things have a way of shaping the developing brain. The bottom line is, when children are stressed, usually there's something that comforts them and turns off the stress response. For these children, you don't have that turning off the stress response. And too much stress too fast, or too much stress too long, changes the way our brains develop. We have kids who don't, their brains are different. The bottom line is their brains are different. They don't respond to stimuli the same way we do. So when you're trying to tell a child, honey, stop doing this, go to school, stay home, let us help you, because everything good is here. The best analogy I've ever heard expressed is, if you're looking down the stair, a long flight of stairs to somebody in a wheelchair, and you were saying the exact same thing to that person, come on up here, everything good is here, okay? That person can't get up by themselves, up that flight of stairs. These kids are damaged, okay? And that's what people don't understand.
Thank you, Brenda. And I'm so glad that you're talking about the psychosocial component of it all. And I want to take a break from the victims and talk about Johns and traffickers and the difference between the two. So a John is someone who buys sex. A trafficker is someone who forces someone to sell sex. So with that in mind, what happens to traffickers when you find the victim? What happens to them? And what happens to the Johns? And with that, what can we do? What can we do about that?
Well, again, speaking from experience, it is the hardest part of my job. I'm going to have to go back to the victim first before I can talk about that. Once I come across a victim, and everything that Brenda was just saying, when I meet someone and they're stuck in this state of mind, from my experiences, I had to realize that I cannot expect too much from this person. It is human nature for us to try to help people, that they don't make it difficult for us. But it's the hardest part of my job, to connect to that victim and to let them know that I'm here to help, to trust me, and let's go down that road. The U.S. Attorney, the feds, we take this approach, the victim-centered approach, which makes our victim very important to our case. I need that victim to understand everything that's happened to them. I need them to be able to sit down, change something in their mind. We may call it reprogramming, that they understand that they were a victim, and then sit down, and then later on, after they get this understanding and they're on a healing path, come back to me and let's talk about what happened, so we can build a case on the trafficker. One of my biggest issues is that we can change this. I believe we can change it. You're always going to have prostitution issues, but what we're doing right now by continuing to educate people, but until we address laws that really deals with the buyers, because a lot of times not a lot happened to them, but some people are starting to pick up, like Brenda's office, they're picking up and starting to really address the buyers. Other countries, other states, a lot of times we always hear about the prostitution sting, not a lot about the John sting. And as long as you have people who are buying, you have people to sell. So,
I mean, the bottom line is we haven't gone to the John program or we haven't really, I think, systematically addressed demand because we as a nation have not matured sufficiently, as far as I'm concerned, to be able to really grapple with that particular issue. And the reason being is that it's so intrinsic in our culture, our mores, our beliefs, our morality. You take a child, for example, there's been a revolution in state law in the past 3 years. Okay, so our laws are continuing to change. Okay, and there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. But the bottom line is, despite the fact that you can't have sex with a 13-year-old, okay, if you're 38 years old, all right, we had to prove force, fraud, or coercion on the state level if she was trafficked. And the reason being is that if you have a child who is sexually assaulted by a 38-year-old man, that's a victim. You put money in that same scenario. You put the exchange of money. All of a sudden, people don't see that child as a victim. She knew what she was doing. She's not a victim. That's a choice. Not just a bad girl. Sad, but that's a choice. Okay? So that's the same thing you hear over and over again. That's not rape. That's not rape. That's not rape. All right? So, one, you've got that. Two, you've got how many men are involved in, if you will, cultures or the subset, the outlying area of prostitution, such as strip clubs and things like that. I mean, it's part of kind of the rite of passages. Men go. It's how they do, a lot of celebrations and things like that in their life. They mark certain kinds of, points. And people have no idea that these are basically legalized brothels. You've got a lot of kids that are there. Men don't understand the fact that there are just their children in these strip clubs, okay, all throughout Miami-Dade County, right?
I have a quick question. So what efforts are being made to train law enforcement? And if you're not in law enforcement, like Christy and Layla, what efforts would you suggest to Agent Williams and Brenda?
Can I, just before we go there, can I go one more time back to this question about the John? So when we look at, say, for instance, the National Football League, right, or the NBA, there was recently a lot of outrage, and players have been suspended for domestic violence incidents where there were, like the nation galvanized around these incidents, which is a wonderful thing. But from my vantage point of being in this work of dealing with communities and individuals that are so deeply compromised on a daily basis, it's a joke, because national football, and I'm not a sports person, so please excuse if I don't have the right terminology, but doing the major championships, the amount of women and girls that are getting trafficked, literally, into the happenings around the sports events is in the thousands. In the thousands. And that is happening right under our nose. It's right everywhere. And it's part of the let's have another beer, and like Brenda was saying, it's so, and that's why I come in as a cultural worker, and what Victor was talking about, this whole thing about how do you reach a victim, how do you get the trust of victimized individuals and communities to even help you to find traffickers, right? Mm-hmm. So the cultural component is really important in terms of building trust, and also in terms of approaching people in the cultural environment that they feel comfortable in, that they feel versed in, right? And unfortunately, pimp culture is very much part of hip hop and pop culture today, so it's very enmeshed, right? So it's sort of like, well, if everybody else does it, why can't I? We're just going to the strip club. Oh, we're just going, this is a bachelor party. We don't know who these strippers are, and plus they're going to do some favors after. And, so it's sort of like, well, I'm not a criminal. I was just hanging out at a party. So the lines are very blurred for these markets. And I think that's where really dialogue and awareness and really we need to stop being hush-hush about these things. And I think we need to have the courage to confront really very large institutions that have become or that are traditionally part of our everyday lives, and that is very difficult for all of us to take a hard look at, but we must go there because guess what? That's where the Johns are.
The law has totally changed. So every single statute in the state criminal system involving juveniles and prostitution has been repealed, except for human trafficking, which means that a human trafficker and a John are the same under the law. Now, I'm not necessarily sure how effective that's going to be, quite frankly. We've had, I don't think, the most organized approach to changing our laws. So we have, for example, we've got a law that says there's a $5,000 fine if you try to buy a prostitute. Okay, well, that has been completely ineffective. It's raised no money. It's about $4,500 more than any fine that exists in the penal system for a misdemeanor, and it's now clogging the courts with all kinds of motions regarding cruel and unusual punishment, unconstitutionality. So it's being challenged throughout. So that's been completely ineffective. So there's a lot of different things that have happened that are perhaps it's better to have a law that can be enforced than to have a law that, if you will, looks symbolic. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
All right.
Absolutely.
So we've had problems. We changed our plea policy regarding Johns. We didn't have judges that supported it. It was you couldn't change things overnight. You just couldn't. That's part of all paradigm shifts in the history of our legal system we've ever seen. So we did try that, and it didn't work.
So what do we have now?
So right now we have a different policy. We've got plea policies. We have a law that says there's a $5,000 fine if you're involved in prostitution, which has been completely ineffective. And we have supposedly the exact same treatment of a John as a human trafficker. But is there a disparity of responsibility and guilt in that situation? I think there is. I think that there's a split in approach regarding Johns. So there is the group that I think looks at this as being, well, you gotta humiliate to get change. And then, if you all remember, maybe about 3-4 years ago, Ashton Kutcher, Demi Moore. So they did this campaign with celebrities, and it really was tremendously criticized, and I think it was pretty much pulled. And that was a campaign that had like celebrities doing something funny or completely unconnected to sexual exploitation, and then at the end you had some kind of message. And I think that was largely misunderstood. I think that most people do not self-identify themselves as perverts, okay? So you definitely have that group of people that are pedophiles and hebophiles, and they're going to be hardcore criminals, and that's their sexual predilection. But I don't think if you ask most men, hey, you want to go out and buy a child, I think they would be horrified. So I think that I think the other approach might be perhaps long-term more effective, which is to raise awareness and to let them know just because she's working really hard to get you to buy her does not mean, okay, that she's not a child and that she's being exploited.
Right. There's a lot of denial out there about what's actually happening.
Yes. And this topic is so complex and so huge. So we're getting into community awareness. We're getting to what a John is, what a victim is, what do victims need, what do survivors need. So just to take it back again, I really do want to ask, how can we shift the mentality away from arresting the victims and towards arresting the buyers?
We don't arrest you. Okay. The 11th Judicial Circuit of Florida, which is Miami-Dade County, does not accept for prosecution juveniles, or except for juveniles arrested for prostitution. Okay, that's not state law, but we don't do it. I can tell you that hasn't changed that much. Okay. So it has helped us bond more with our victims. It's not stopping them from going back out, running away, and still engaging in prostitution. Okay.
The problem is that's just Florida. And what this, because they have a law called the Safe Harbor Law that supposedly protect these kids, but all it does is give officers other options than arresting. They can still arrest, and I know they don't do that here, but it's only 16 states that have this law.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the problem with the law is you have to go a lot further. I mean, the sound bites are really simple. We have to stop criminalizing our victims. Okay, step back, all right? If you have a law that says juvenile prostitution is illegal, and you don't have any infrastructure, you don't have shelters, you don't have any laws that support these kids coming in, okay, then you basically have the Pimp Relief Act, okay? Because what are you going to do? You're going to incentivize pimps to only be working minors, okay? Because what's going to happen to their product, all right? So it's a lot more complex than people think, all right?
Don, I think you wanted to respond to that.
Well, I just want to say, at Christie House, what we have is a drop-in center. And the way we approach these victims is to tell them what we offer at the drop-in center, which is we have groups from cooking to yoga to learning, getting your learner's permit, to trauma-informed groups, leadership groups. survivor-led groups. So we have all kinds of, if you come, you get $5 for every group you participate in. We'll come pick you up, we feed you dinner, and we tutor you, whatever you need. And so that we offer that as a way to make sort of a transition, because we know that, first of all, residential facilities are really expensive and very rare. We can help a lot more girls do this. Do we keep them safe? Do we keep them from running away? No. Mm-hmm. That's a choice that they're still making. It's a choice we try to discourage because we're offering other incentives to do other things. But sometimes with these children, it takes a long time for them to be willing to make that change. Anytime they're under stress, the first thing they're going to do is run back to what they know. And so there is a big debate out in our society right now that you should be aware of. There's a lot of people, child welfare people, who believe that these children should be locked up for their own good because they go out and they do really dangerous things. And then there is other group of people, mostly advocates, or what they'd call the case coordinator type, who believe that we need to let these girls have choices, because one of the few things they've had in their lives is choices. And so we need to allow them to make those choices. And in working with them therapeutically, we want those running away incidents to be smaller and less often, and hopefully that we can connect them up with the services they need. But we're talking about children with multiple needs that requires a whole group of agencies to be working with them.
So I'll weigh in on that, okay? First of all, back to Safe Harbor. The huge gaping flaw with Safe Harbor is that what Safe Harbor does is it creates a new dependency class. So before it used to be, unless a child was victimized by their parents, meaning there was neglect or there was abuse by the parents, you couldn't take the child out of that household, right? Okay. Now, what Safe Harbor does is it lets officers choose to not charge the person, and it creates a new dependency class, which means that that child now comes under the DCF system. But here's the thing, okay? A biological parent, or a legal guardian in our state has certain rights over a child. Okay, all right. So when that kid says she's 13 and she's 11 o'clock at night, see ya, I'm leaving the house, the parent can say, no, you're not. Get back in there, right? Mm-hmm. So we all know that. We all had parents who said something similar to us when we were getting a little bit crazy, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. DCF system can't do that. All they can do is watch that kid leave and then call the police. Mm-hmm. Okay, which, by the way, there's not going to be any response after that unless you're telling the police that that child's about to be the victim of some kind of heinous attack. All right.
And the other part of that is there was not funding put in for residential care, which is expensive. And so we have a few residential facilities. We have an interesting program here where foster parents are specifically trained to work with these girls, and there's only one girl allowed in that foster family at a time. Mm-hmm. But again, we're talking about not nearly enough money for the residential kinds of care that these girls need.
But again, one second. Layla, I think you wanted to respond really quickly.
Well, I just wanted to chime in real quickly to say that when we speak about, who are the traffickers and the pimps, clearly, traditionally, and for more time than we all can remember, there has been organized crime and mafias and so forth, people who are really on the career path of becoming organized criminals. But I think the proliferation that we're seeing right here is more sort of like a opportunist sort of entrepreneurism in the sex industry, where we have to, even I feel, and I see those kids, for instance, and also adults, it's not like here's the bad guys and there are the traffickers and here's the victims and they're the good people, but rather they oftentimes come from the same communities, meaning that even the traffickers have been victims. And I mean, just to think about any person in the right mind would not get up in the morning and think how they can brutalize children or other people, right? So that alone, in and of itself, tells you that there's something really off with that person. Oftentimes, traffickers themselves come from communities like that, have been sexually abused themselves, or come from families where there's sexual violence, mm-hmm. and blah blah blah. Mm-hmm. And what you said before, the cross indicators of poverty and so forth. So that was my point.
No, and that's a really great point. And we're talking about all these different components. But what I would like to know, going back to my original question, training law enforcement. I mean, you guys have all these different perspectives and experiences. But how can we utilize that information to truly train law enforcement?
So but let's play devil's advocate. First of all, Vic and I do training a bit every single week. We are constantly training. Okay, so we have a whole detached unit of investigators that are attached from other departments that compose our human trafficking investigative task force. Okay, so we are absolutely training them, but train them to do what? Exactly. I mean,
how to talk to victims, how to deal with the traffickers. What do we do? What policies do we make?
I mean, I hear what you're saying, but it's just so not that simple. Okay, you're talking again. Go back. You're talking about a child who is damaged, who believes that is her boyfriend, her protector, her spiritual leader, her whatever. Okay, and now you're saying that I'm going to arrest that person, and you've been a victim, and I'm going to help you. They don't want your help. Okay, they don't want your help. So you're trying to help them out of get up from that down there to the stairs, and they don't see themselves as victims, okay, and they don't want to deal with you, and you are the police, and they don't want having to do with that because they're going to be branded as snitch.
We do training at Miami International Airport, and one of the things we did before we started to, so how do you identify victims that are coming through the airport, which is what the training was about. And what do you do, which is the other piece, the more important part, is what do you do if you find a victim? So before we were willing to go out and work in MIA and train people, we said you need to have a policy in place. What happens to the person who's taking the ticket who suspects that this is a case of commercial sexual exploitation? Well, they set up a system, so they have a special code. They call law enforcement that's at the airport. Law enforcement responds in a certain way. One of the things we have to do is what Brenda is saying is, okay, what's the policy? What are we going to do once we respond to these victims? I've found law enforcement to be incredibly sympathetic and incredibly cooperative with trying to find these victims, and then call us and say, okay, well, we have somebody and we're looking for some place for them to stay. It's really, really difficult. And so we have to do a lot of work at that section of what are we going to do once we identify these girls? They're not being arrested anymore. So how do we accommodate them? How do we work with them so that they're going to be comfortable, feel safe enough to cooperate with law enforcement, or start to choose a different path?
And I do agree. Brenda makes a good point. Yeah, it's hard. You guys feeling the pain in this? Is this hard or what? It's not as easy as it seems or what you may see on TV. And I agree. Law enforcement around this country are not trained. Polaris is one of the organizations. They run the national hotline for human trafficking. They're 24/7, and they do a lot of statistics. One of the things I have to say, working here and working with people like Brenda and the rest of the panel, is that we're trying our hardest educating people, and Polaris tells us by the calls that they get. When they get calls from Florida, it's not, can you tell me what human trafficking is? No, they're calling with details. They know what human trafficking is. So that's a good sign for us, but it's not enough. You can't talk about this enough. You can't, every opportunity I get, whether I'm a panelist or sitting out there where you are, I go. It's that serious. It is that serious. And so, yeah, law enforcement, we've been behind. Note, human trafficking laws have only been around since 2000. And in 2008, when, every now and then since 2000, you had a case here, a case there, but maybe 2006, 2008, somewhere in between there is when really it started to pop up on the national scene. Now everybody knows, whoa, we've had a problem, and it's not getting better, But this helps. This is the kind of stuff that has to go on every day, and you just have to be involved. And from schools, I came from Broward, it needs to be part of a curriculum that they learn every year. Teachers, lawyers, everyone needs to have training in human trafficking awareness at all times.
Okay. Another thing that actually has to change, and hopefully you guys will graduate and make this happen as well, okay? And that is, why doesn't Florida's public school system have media literacy? If you guys are completely, and we all are at this point now, completely growing up saturated with radio, television, text messages, cell phones, web, everything in your life is constantly bombarded of media, okay? Yet we don't train kids in high school how to understand when they're being exploited, okay? When you talk about hip hop and rap, okay, how many people really understand when they're 14 or 13 that Viacom and Ted Turner or Turner Industries owns most of it, okay? And that they're shaping the contracts of these musicians and shaping the content, okay? So when you have quote unquote Black American culture being portrayed, really? Okay, is that what that is? Or is that Viacom selling what they think is going to be the equivalent of Iron Man 16? Okay.
Thank you, Brenda. That was such a great response. But actually, because I do want to have some time for question and answers and also to talk about what UNICEF is doing. But really quick, now we're on the idea of what we can do as a community. We can't just rely on the government. We can't just rely on police officers. So what can we do as a community to really make a change, to step up and empower ourselves to really do something about this?
Can I just revisit, I'm sorry, can I just revisit strip clubs there for a second? Yeah. I won't put anybody on the spot. If I said how many people here are Johns, I'm not going to get too many hands raised, I hope. If I say how many people have visited a strip club, I think I'm going to get a lot more hands raised. In Miami, it has become very cool to go to strip clubs, even with your dates or even with girls. And we've had girls from every single strip club in Miami. Anybody who tells you, oh, no, all our girls are overage is lying. We've just had a 13-year-old girl. They Club Madonna for 2.5 days, I think, and they're right back to work. And the owner, of course, looked stressed in the eye and said he couldn't possibly imagine that he had underage girls working at his club. That's crazy. So one of the things you can do is don't go to strip clubs.
This whole thing about what can we do, right? And Brenda said, well, train law enforcement exactly to what. And I heard a couple of years ago Brenda doing a presentation about, the wonderful efforts that they do at the state attorney's office and how, IT literacy in law enforcement really has to go to the next dimension because that's the whole thing. It's that the internet, and this is what you just spoke about, IT literacy in schools and media literacy and so forth, that unfortunately most of the people in law enforcement, right, especially with street experience, like having longevity in the field, they're much older and they didn't actually grow up in the digital age as much as your average, prostituted child, trafficked child, pimp, teenaging, boy from the neighborhood or whatnot. There's a lot of media savvy there and how to catch up with that. And on the web, of course, I hope that the word is spreading that there's this whole what they call it the black web, or what they call it the dark net, which is like not visible, but you have to have secret, you have to have access codes, but literally it's sort of like a shadow room within the web that if you know the codes and how to get in it, I mean, we're talking the most utterly grotesque and insidious worlds live in that. And they really evade law enforcement and so forth. So I want to say we are law enforcement, and then people like to talk about, rely on the government. Well, who's the government? Well, we are the government, you know what I mean? And the more we have civic participation at every level, in the schools, in the cafeteria, at the supermarket checkout counter and whatnot, that is where the critical intersection happens, because we are the ones. There is no, at the end of the day, how many times have you heard in the news, that house was boarded up for I don't know how long. We never thought anything of it. They were friendly neighbors. Well, guess what? They've been sex slaving people for the past 10 years or whatnot. There's a case like those all the time in the news, and people are just not engaged. And it's the next door neighbors. And it's not because people are willfully obstructive to, the access of justice and freedom for all, but rather because we are feeling uncomfortable to really speak about these things, because and also this whole this explosion of gang rapes and so forth. It is the threshold when you see 3 buddies doing it. Well, they already did the dirt. I may as well, So it's the threshold of what we collectively hold up as the paradigm that we see we must have as a sort of grant rights and egalitarian access to resources and to all. That's really, we all have to uphold that. And culturally, I think that is paramount, because when you look at pop culture today, and I work in the work I do arts workshops and of all sorts, and I work a lot with hip hop, but not hip hop as it is, like you were just talking about, soul today, but rather the art of putting words to a beat, and that is ancient old. That's not new. But what's the content you put in it? Is it going to be misogynist, violent messages? Or is it going to be to raise consciousness, right? So how we engage in consuming and proliferating culture in our everyday lives, and how we bring these dialogues to the kitchen table, to the cafeteria table, to the university campus, to anywhere. That's really where we are the ambassadors.
Thank you, Leila. Thank you. No, and really, really quick, before we go into question and answer, I do want to say something on my own end with my own experience and with my work with UNICEF. You have to change your perspective as an individual. The idea of global citizenship, this is what we're doing. This is why we're here. This is not because it's an issue in Africa or it's an issue in Florida. We all live in the same world. The idea that this is happening to another human should just be reason enough. So we should change our perspective and shift that, so that way we can actually communicate with other people, so that we can actually work on building a community. Because to be quite honest, I don't know how many people now really know the names of their neighbors, or even sit down and say, hey, let's have a conversation. The more strangers you create, the more likely issues like this will happen. Thank you. Thank you. So this is time for question and answers. Anyone else?
I have a question. I'm sorry, I don't know the name. But you mentioned that there's laws, but there's not infrastructures or structure to back the laws up. How come the states or federal government doesn't back up already existing organizations, like subsidize them and help them create a bigger impact?
Well, part of that is funding. Okay, obviously, you know what we've been through in terms of the state and the recession and things like that. So part of it is there just wasn't been money. The budgets have been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and only now are we trying to get back on our feet financially. But that $5,000 fine I told you about before, that was designed to fund shelters. Okay, but again, what happens, I think, partly is that you don't have people working together. So now I think we've learned in the past 3 years, law enforcement needs advocacy groups, and advocacy groups needs law enforcement, because if you do it without cooperation and working on a unified vision, then you've got things like this. I mean, we can tell you that's a law that's not going to work, but that was a law, I think, that was really kind of advocacy group initiated, thinking that it was going to solve all their solutions. It didn't solve anything. It's just caused a glut in our legal system. So part of this is who's going to pay for it, right? And do you want it enough where that's going to become a priority over something else in the budget and for that legislative session? And that's the reality.
And real quick to follow up, how many of you guys voted?
Thank you. I was just going to say that.
That was such a good point, yes.
No, and not to bring politics, but really, what's your interest? That's how politicians work. And if you come at numbers and you can show, like, hey, this is important to us, and you put it on a ballot, we want funding. That's how it works. But you got to step outside of, me sometimes, and go out and, like, what's concerning me in my community. And you said it a lot better than I was going to say it. But yeah, whether it's human trafficking, whatever that cause may be, everybody needs to take up a cause.
Yeah. And I want to just chime in, because Victor, I so agree, and I was going to say it just before, which is, unfortunately, and I'm glad to see a lot of hands go up in this room that you guys voted, but by demographic, it was really in this last midterm election we just saw, which had an unprecedented, in recent memory, non-participation. It was the youngest, sort of eligible voters that did not participate. That, to me, is very troubling on every level, not just on the human trafficking level, but on every other issue that we are confronting today, which there are plenty.
I came a little late, so I'm not sure, but I think you're from Broward, state attorney's office, and then Miami. We have like county and state representatives.
You got federal. I'm a federal state, but we work in day, but we can
Although
work
it's
all
state,
over.
I'm a state employee, but yeah.
The reason I'm saying that is because speaking with the human trafficking, one of the officers for the human trafficking unit in City Fort Lauderdale, it's been expressed that there is a huge problem with prosecuting Johns and traffickers because of the lack of county municipality cooperation. what are you guys as a federal or state, in the sense of the victim is found in Fort Lauderdale, the trafficker is from Miami-Dade, the John is from Polk County, that type of a situation. They're only able to deal with the person within their municipality. It's kind of a hands-off to deal with the trafficker that's in Dade. They've been having problems where across Tri-County there hasn't been cooperation. Are there policies in place or being put in place, or are there, what is going on with reference?
On the federal level, that's not our issue.
Well, I mean, you know, and it is and it isn't,
Yeah,
because
I'm just
but
joking.
yeah, I mean the reality is that it's a sandbox, right? So you have like who's going to get credit for this case, right? You're going to have we have all kinds of different laws, different thresholds and stuff in terms of how to file a case, et cetera. So the reality is that no prosecutor wants to be woken up at 3 a.m. on the state level and be working, you know, all night on something that's going to go federal. Okay, so we do have a few issues back and forth, and who's going to get credit for at the end of the day for this? Okay, so you do have some of that, but I think largely that has been surpassed by the need to get things done more and more. So I think that we work extremely well with the feds. I am very often trying to pitch things to the federal government, which I know exceed my jurisdiction. So, you know, we are definitely working, I think, much more collectively and collaboratively to help each other to basically get the bad guy.
And
Yeah.
we have our first male case of trafficking here that it's our case, but they're working it.
Right.
You know, so I agree. I mean, again, not to bring up politics, but it's the system that we work in.
Yeah.
I'm fighting for dollars. Hey,
Right.
look what I did. I arrested these people. I need more money, you know, and it's a crappy system.
Right.
So we, you know, and I don't get credit for saving lives. I don't get the ad. Look how many people I saved. Look how many people I arrest. Look what I seize. So again, it's something that our politicians need to know, but we don't care enough to make them change that.
Yeah, and again, it goes down to civic engagement once again, because it's who holds the fire, you know, to the politicians to move on these issues. It's the populations, right? We need to be engaged, and I do think that there is an overlap here with that, and I certainly don't mean this for this to come across in any negative way, but the more marginalized populations are, the more I've come from my firsthand experience, the less I find them to be engaged on that level, right? So how can we bring citizen activism back into the hands of the people that really need it, right? As opposed to having stakeholders stand for marginalized communities and this is what they need, you know, and victim advocacy and all of that. That's all wonderful, but until the day that we can get victims empowered to the point where they can speak for themselves and go into the prevention and that arena, that's when we truly facilitate empowerment. And that's where we all come in. You know, that's why we can't just, you know, look at others or to others to make the change, but we are truly the change. And how active are we in that? You know, and how much are we carrying that conversation?
Can I add another wish list? Okay, so one of the what Layla just said. Okay, so how do you get victims to, you know, come forward? Okay, well, we've got a bizarre discovery rules of criminal procedure in our state relative to the entire nation. Okay, so you can tell I can feel a little passionate about this. All right, so okay, so we've got first of all, in the federal system, a victim comes in. There's no deposition of that victim, right? Okay, there may not even be certain reports that are even turned over. Okay, in our state, a victim. So just think about this. Think about a prostitution ring. I got a case right now. 4 defendants. That means 4 defense attorneys. They have the right under our criminal system to depose a victim in a criminal case. We're one of 13 states that has depositions at all, okay, in the nation, and we're only a few handful that allow victims or children of sexual assault to be deposed, okay? So you just think about this. You get a trauma-damaged 14, 15, 16-year-old, okay, all right? Now, she's going to sit in the room with 4 men or 4 attorneys whose job it is to zealously represent their person who exploited them, all taking turns questioning this kid, okay, in front of a court reporter. Now you're going to put her on for trial after that. Think the kid's going to withstand? Is she going to stay with me, or is she going to run if she knows, if you really explain to her what's about to happen? Okay? Yeah. I mean, it's medieval. All right? Medieval.
Really is,
All right? You know,
You're present in the deposition, though, correct?
course I am, but that doesn't change the fact that they have under our criminal procedures the absolute right to question her as long as they want to, okay, and then to alternate doing it.
I just want to say we're gonna end now, but
She had an
We have a
answer
couple
for
more.
change.
yes.
So I'm just a citizen activist, so I'm part of 1 Billion Rising, which is a movement that Leda was talking about. So it's just a movement. It's like slow food and like abolition, and we have the right to vote. So those things, when we all realize what's going on, we stand up and we vote, or you see something happening to somebody. One thing that I know, I'm from the music business, I'm a mom, I don't work as a professional here, so it gives me a perspective that makes me feel like I want to be empowered. So all I care is that everybody leaves here going, there's something I can do about it. So I don't like to judge other people, but I know that they're professionals who can back us up. It's not up to me to make a moral decision, so we just made some cards for what can I do, so people feel like they can leave here not going like the world's a bad place. So there are 3 little things here. There's the stop the sale of our children for sex phone number. So if you see some women getting dragged down the street, you see a kid on the corner, you can call them, and somebody professional like Vic can follow up. There's the Coordinated Victims Assistance Center, which is an amazing facility here that has all the services under one roof. So if somebody gets punched, somebody's hungry, they need legal, so somebody's being abused, you can call that number. And then there's an organization called Lauren's Kids. There's a woman who was abused when she was a kid, and she talks about how you talk to your kids so they can prevent abuse. So anybody who wants any, you can take it, but anything, just speak up wherever you are, just speak up.
Thank you, Myra. I do want to say something really, really quick, and I wish someone would have said that when I was in college. You guys are in this seat taking these classes, hearing these people. It is you that is going to take that information, question it, and put something new out there. If you really want to make an impact and use your education, whether it's from Harvard or FIU, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter when you really want to make an impact. You take that information and you do something different. You don't just go along with the stream. You have an opportunity that people die every day just to have to speak English or even have an American passport. So use that. Take advantage of that. Thank you for having us so much. Thank you.
You got to go home now?